is Lee Humphreys. I am a professor and currently the chair of the communication department at Cornell University. That's an interesting question. So I guess I graduated from college in 1999 and went to work at an internet startup company in New York City where we were a consulting firm that helped companies think about their kind of like usability and how people used their primarily websites. And so that was really great because it showed me the disconnect between the way people design technology and the way that people actually use technology, which is something I've been interested in for a really long time. And one of our clients right before I went back to graduate school was this like group texting company that was trying to figure out what social communication could look like on a mobile phone. So, which is interesting because at the time, phones, now we think of phones and text messaging, you can see the thread, whereas you didn't used to be able to see a conversation with someone. The order in which you got the text message was what you would see. And so you didn't see what the person had sent previously. And so it just felt really disjointed. And they weren't grouped as conversations. And so anyways, it was just this really interesting time. And it got me thinking about mobile phones. And so when I went to graduate school, I was interested in mobile phones and how on earth they were changing public space. Yeah. I was really interested in particular questions. And it's funny because I actually grew up on a farm. And but at the time I had been living in New York City and then I went to graduate school in Philadelphia. So I'm in these major cities and it just is so foreign to me, how you can have so many people so closely together and still have privacy of any kind. It just was very weird to me. And then all of a sudden people were talking on their phones and speaking about incredibly intimate things amongst hundreds of people. And I was like, how on earth is this happening? It just felt very odd to me as someone who, we didn't have a whole lot of people around. And so you really had a sense of privacy. And so it was just a very different kind of context in which people would be sharing fairly intimate details of their lives on their phones. And other people were just sort of going about their business. I would say probably one of the biggest had to do with questions of space and what did it mean to have private conversations in public space was a really big issue. How does it change public space? How does it change the nature of it? Was seen as incredibly disruptive and rude, and this is a terrible thing that people are on their phones and completely oblivious to the world around them. And so I think that was one of the really big issues. I think another really big issue had to do with, safety and driving, and that was a big policy issue that was pretty interesting in the United States. Elsewhere, there were questions about the safety of phones, having phones so close to your head. Is this good to be having these, waves going so close to our heads for so many hours a day? Yeah. So I would say those were some of the big issues, some of which I was involved with, some of which I wasn't in my research. But yeah, these questions of what does it mean to have these phones now in places where phones weren't? And what do we think about them? How does that change social interaction, cultural interactions, family dynamics, all of that stuff? Yeah, one of the things I think the US was kind of slow on mobile phone adoption compared in particular to Japan and Korea. and then, of course, Scandinavia. So it wasn't until, I would say, really 2007 when the iPhone came out that the US became more of a dominant leader. And so if you look at where the research was happening, it was outside the US. So one of the things that I think is really remarkable about the field of mobile communication is that it has, and I say this as an American scholar, right? It has always had a very international intellectual community, which I think raises really interesting questions about policy, about culture, about language, about, social norms cannot be taken for granted. And so I think that is a really important aspect. And I would say one of the key strengths of mobile communication then and now is that it continues to be a incredibly globally diverse intellectual community. So annually we get together as part of the International Communication Association, and we have a very active mobile pre-conference which attracts people from all over. So just personally, I've done work in Indonesia, and I've done work in Germany, and I've done work in Australia, and I collaborate with people in all of these places because I don't speak German or, I speak English in Australia, so I'm just fine, but I don't speak Bahasa Indonesian. And so to think about ways that we can collaborate to find and understand how mobile phones are shaping social interactions is something that has always been of great interest to me. One of the things, I think there are trends in questions, right? And so there's different kinds of, and this is the case for like all technology, I think. And as we try to understand how does the internet impact us, how do, the kinds of questions change with how the technology changes. And this is always a really interesting, and it's one of the great things, I think, when you study the way people use technology is that technology is always changing. So there's always something new to study. For example, at some points there have been more and less concern about, whether you call it problematic phone use or people being addicted to their cell phones, right? Like those kinds of questions have come up. Now one of the big questions that we're seeing has to do with how the platforms, the major platforms, the big tech, are constraining the ways and the opportunities that mobile phones have to connect people. And I think the sort of economics behind it and the political economy behind these technologies, I think, are also, importantly being critiqued right now. The thing about social media right now is that it has changed so dramatically. Like originally it was about interpersonal and, small group or large group even dynamics. And I think now what social media has largely become is completely commercialized. And so it's now really become entertainment in wonderful ways, right? But people aren't posting so much as they are going online and consuming the social media of others. And I think one of the things that does when it comes to phubbing is that, we share things all the time. We're like, oh my God, look at this video. Oh my God, look at this, share this. And I can turn my phone to you and I can, so I think hopefully, people will see phones as something both that we recognize that we need to attend to certain things, right? Like if I get a text from someone, the person I'm with knows that I probably need to check it to make sure it's not, for instance, now it's like one of my kids. Do I need to, And I think people are less offended around people checking their phones than they used to, and I think the other aspect is that the things are a lot more shareable. Things, it's like distractions and entertainment and, and if it's easier if it's just you can put it off, you can like not have your phone with you if it's just, I don't know, seeing an update from, I don't know, Bad Bunny or someone like that, right, than it is like that you can put off for an hour to be with your friend. But the interpersonal dynamics are harder to say, no, I'm not going to look at my phone if my parents call, or, my partner calls, or no one's calling, but parents sometimes call, but like if it's a text, right, like you can those are harder to ignore. But I think people understand it now much more than they used to. So this notion of cataloging is this idea that people actively create traces about their offline lives through their phones, right? And they share it with others, or sometimes they share it with other people, sometimes just for themselves, right? So it's like you take photos, you like make a note of things, you do these things on your phone. And what becomes really interesting is like the distinctions between what people share and what they don't, right? Because Apple knows every time I take a photo. And in fact, even when I went to do the voice memo, it was like, we're going to place you. Is it okay if we use your location for this voice memo, right? So it's like anytime you use a phone, there's always potential locative data being collected, as well as potentially social data, like who else is involved and how long and where and what. And so I think what becomes interesting is, from a privacy perspective, when or how that data is used without me knowing, without me consenting, without me fully understanding where else that data is going, and how it is then being used to present different kinds of opportunities to me later on, primarily through advertising, right? But I think, generally speaking, the data that we try to collect through cataloging is at this level, and then there's all of this metadata around it, particularly when it comes to location and who else might be present. And so I think, there are privacy implications, and we know that some actors are better than others in terms of like the tech providers and app services at using that information responsibly versus, again, using it to just advertise to us. I think, and this is where it's always super interesting when you go into various app settings to see, wait, why are you collecting my battery use? And why are you collecting this? And why are you collecting that? And they tend to collect a lot of things if you let them. I think that is a very different thing than the kind of things that people take photos of or put in their calendars or things like that, which are purposeful for a particular moment at a particular time in a given context. What happens to that data over time, people don't always think through, but I don't think there are always huge privacy implications from it either, right? Like, I don't know, I jot things down, and actually like my calendar, like I love my calendars, right? I live by my calendar, and it's actually super fun to go back and look at my calendar from like 15 years ago, right? And I had back-to-back meetings, and who was I meeting with, and what was it about? And and it's only interesting to me, right? Like no one else cares about it. But there is this kind of notion that's like, this is what my life was like back then. And so it does become, even though I create it for the moment, there is really, I think, beneficial and interesting things around looking back at these older aspects of using phones. And the problem is, phones, they don't make it very easy to go back that far, even though, of course, they have the data, right? Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I don't talk at all about in that project really is about the question of persuasion and thinking about how social media are used to persuade people in various ways, right? To engage in particular behaviors or ways of thinking. Some people talk about disinformation or misinformation, misleading information. I think one of the things that I don't talk about is how the affective, seemingly interpersonal aspects of social media. And there's tremendous work on this. I haven't studied it as much, but how they dramatically shape the way people receive information and then share information in ways which might have unintended democratic consequences, or perhaps they're intended, depending on how you think about it, right? And so I do think we need to be really thoughtful about the ways that these platforms contribute to or help to erode fundamental democratic principles. And I think that is something that we need to be really thoughtful about, and that's something that I didn't address as much in that article. I would say that there were other concerns that I had, right? Like much of my work has not addressed questions of democracy or politics or elections or anything like that. And so, or even like journalism, right? Like I've primarily been looking at interpersonal dynamics, intrapersonal dynamics, and a broader culture of how we think about the role of technology in society, right? Not in these particular domains. And so, but one of the things that's become quite interesting is how things have become increasingly political and divided in ways that they are really impacting the everyday, and they are impacting different communities quite significantly. I mean, I still think that we need to be quite thoughtful about what it means to be having commercial actors playing this incredibly important role in society without thinking about their democratic role. I mean, this was the thing about broadcast television and radio historically, is that it was seen as a public good. And I think these tech companies have gotten a big pass from a policy perspective, from a regulatory perspective, because they haven't had the same kinds of public good responsibilities that broadcast has traditionally had. And so I think, I think that's something that continues to be a huge issue. And I think when it comes to phones, as with any technology, right, they can bring us together and they can pull us apart. And so in general, like, I love my phone. I mean, I think it's fabulous, right? And I'm certainly not addicted to it. I can put it down for hours. I can forget about it, But I think, the key things that we need to be thinking about are what are the ways to maximize the benefits of it and minimize the detriments on an individual, community, and, global scale. And I think that those are key questions that will continue. It's a long future research trajectory, certainly. I hope that we continue the international collaborations around how phones are used. I feel like particularly, at least in the US, there's a kind of isolationist perspective that's emerging, which I think is really detrimental from a scholarly perspective. I think we have a lot to learn also from the global South in terms of technological innovation. We have always, some of the most innovative studies and insights have come from the global South, and I think we need to continue that really important area of research. And then fundamentally, I think, as with all scholarship, I think we fundamentally want to think about how the work that we do can be used to minimize divides rather than enhance them. I think mobile phones are super interesting and exciting. The only other thing actually that I will say about why it's really important to pay attention to mobile phones is not only because of their ubiquity, but because they raise different questions around materiality. And I think sometimes when we talk about AI or we talk about different things, it feels so intangible. And I think one of the things that mobile phones do for us is they give us this thing to hold on to see exactly how it's working, even though it's often a black box. But that then becomes an entry point for further critique and analysis to kind of dig into these questions more specifically. So I'm super excited for the field of mobile communication. I think it will continue to be an exciting area of research and one that is poised to have tremendous impact.